To this day, theologians, historians, and archaeologists cannot fully explain how a priest without a documented lineage, without a recorded birth, and without a confirmed death came to occupy the center of the greatest priestly promise in ancient history. But he existed, and the records show exactly what happened when Abraham knelt before him. Set the scene. The year is approximately 1920 before the Common Era. The valley of Siddim, a fertile plain near what is today the southern shore of the Dead Sea, has just witnessed one of the most brutal battles recorded in ancient texts. 4 kings from the east, led by Chedorlaomer of Elam, have just plundered 5 entire cities. Sodom and Gomorrah have been emptied. The armies of those cities fell into the natural tar pits that covered the valley. Natural traps of hot pitch, with temperatures exceeding 150 degrees Celsius, capable of melting leather sandals in seconds. Survivors fled to the mountains. Among the captured was Lot, Abraham's nephew, along with his entire household, his possessions, and likely dozens of servants. Abraham, at this point in the narrative, was not a general. He was a semi-nomadic shepherd living near Hebron, among the oaks of Mamre, roughly 45 kilometers south of what is today Jerusalem. But news of Lot's capture changed everything. Genesis chapter 14, verse 14, records that Abraham mustered 318 trained men, born in his own house. Consider the scale. A pastoral camp capable of maintaining 318 warriors trained from birth represented an operation of at least 1,200 to 1,500 people in total, counting women, children, the elderly, and non-combatant servants. Abraham was not a poor shepherd. He was the leader of a community the size of a small Canaanite village, and he did the unthinkable. With 318 men, he pursued a combined army of 4 kings that had already defeated 5 fortified cities. The distance from Hebron to Dan in the far north, where Abraham finally caught the invaders, is approximately 240 kilometers. Across mountainous terrain, without paved roads, carrying bronze weapons and provisions for days, that march took between 6 and 8 days of forced movement, covering roughly 30 to 40 kilometers daily, the equivalent of walking from Sao Paulo to Curitiba, climbing and descending hills, sleeping on the ground, knowing that at the destination waited an army that had just crushed 5 nations. The strategy was nocturnal. Genesis chapter 14, verse 15, reports that Abraham divided his men and attacked at night. The tactic was sophisticated, a multi-front assault on a camp that expected no resistance from so small a force. The surprise worked. Chedorlaomer's army was defeated and pursued to Hobah, north of Damascus, another 160 kilometers beyond. In total, Abraham and his 318 men covered approximately 400 kilometers in continuous pursuit. 400 kilometers, the distance between Belo Horizonte and the coast of Rio de Janeiro. On foot, armed, fighting. And it is precisely at that moment, on the triumphant return, with the spoils of 4 kings and hundreds of liberated prisoners, that something without precedent occurs. Abraham, the man who had just accomplished one of the greatest military feats of the ancient world, encounters someone before whom he chooses to bow. Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20, records the scene with brutal economy of words, just 3 verses. 55 words in the original Hebrew, and within those 55 words stands one of the most enigmatic figures in all of ancient literature. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. He blessed Abraham, and Abraham gave him a tithe of everything. No introduction, no explanation of origin, no family context, no scribe recorded where he came from. No chronicler noted who his parents were, and the text never mentions his death. Silence. Observe the scene through the eyes of someone who was there. Abraham returns covered in dust and blood from a campaign lasting weeks. His men carry spoils that included gold, silver, livestock, textiles, and provisions enough to supply 5 cities. The king of Sodom comes out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, near Salem, to negotiate the return of the prisoners. It was a political meeting between military leaders. And in the middle of that scene of raw power, a man appears carrying bread and wine. Not weapons, not gold, bread and wine. The name Melchizedek in Hebrew is composed of 2 roots. Melech means king. Tzedek means justice, king of justice, and he was king of Salem, which in Hebrew derives from the root shalom, peace, king of justice, ruler of peace. Consider the semantic weight. In the ancient world, names were not accidental. They were declarations of identity and function. A man whose name meant king of justice, governing a city whose name meant peace, was, by linguistic definition, the embodiment of 2 concepts that rarely coexisted in antiquity, where justice almost always came by the sword and peace almost always came through submission. Salem, according to most scholars, including Flavius Josephus in Jewish Antiquities, Book 1, Chapter 10, Section 2, corresponds to the location that would later be called Jerusalem. Psalm 76, verse 2, confirms it directly. In Salem also is his tabernacle and his dwelling place in Zion. If that identification is correct, Melchizedek governed the same rocky hill that 900 years later David would conquer from the Jebusites and where Solomon would build the temple. The same ground, the same place, separated by nearly a millennium. But there is still the most unsettling element of the narrative to reveal. Melchizedek was a priest, and that should not have been possible. Examine the details. In the system Moses would establish centuries later, the priesthood was exclusively Levitical. Only descendants of Aaron from the tribe of Levi could serve as priests. Lineage was everything. Without documented lineage, there was no priesthood. Full stop. But Melchizedek performed priestly functions at least 500 years before Levi was born, at least 600 years before Aaron was consecrated, and at least 700 years before the tabernacle was erected in the Sinai wilderness. He operated entirely outside every system Israel would ever know. And most unsettling of all, Abraham, the patriarch from whom the entire nation of Israel would descend, recognized that priestly authority as legitimate. The tithe Abraham gave was not symbolic. The Hebrew word used in Genesis 14, verse 20, is maser, an exact tenth. From the spoils of 4 defeated kings, Abraham separated 10% and handed it to Melchizedek. Measure the magnitude of that gesture. The spoils of a war involving 9 kings and at least 5 sacked cities represented an incalculable fortune. Livestock, precious metals, textiles, food, slaves, the accumulated wealth of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. 10% of that was enough to sustain an entire city for months, and Abraham handed it over with no recorded hesitation, no negotiation, no conditions. The scene becomes even more revealing when compared to what happens immediately afterward. The king of Sodom, Bera, proposes that Abraham keep all the goods and return only the people. It was a generous offer by the standards of the time. The victor of a war had legal claim to everything, including the prisoners, but Abraham refuses. Genesis chapter 14, verses 22 and 23. Records the response. I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and have sworn that I will take nothing, from a thread to a sandal strap. Abraham gave 10% to Melchizedek and 0% to himself. Witness the moment, the greatest warrior in the fertile crescent of that generation. The man who had just defeated 4 kings with 318 shepherds, refuses the entire wealth of the world and honors a priest without genealogy. This is not generic devotion. It is the recognition of absolute authority. And then, As abruptly as he appeared, Melchizedek vanishes from the text. After Genesis 14, he is not mentioned again in the Torah. He does not appear in Exodus. He does not appear in Leviticus. He does not appear in Numbers. He does not appear in Deuteronomy. No reference in Joshua, Judges, or Samuel. No chronicler recorded where he was buried. No heir was named. No succession was documented. More than 800 years of absolute silence, and then the real mystery begins. Because after all that silence, a single verse breaks the void. Psalm 110 verse 4, written by David around 1005 before the Common Era, declares, "The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." David did not say, according to the order of Aaron. He did not say, according to the lineage of Levi. He invoked a priesthood that existed before any system, before any tribe, before any temple, and he did so with a divine oath, the most irrevocable form of declaration in the ancient Hebrew world. Calculate the theological weight of that phrase. The entire priestly system of Israel, with its more than 613 ritual commandments, its 4 types of sacrifice, its specific fabrics for priestly vestments, blue, purple, and crimson, its golden bells on the high priest's robe, its purification laws requiring 7 days of isolation, its grain offerings of fine flour mixed with oil, all of it operated under the order of Aaron. And David, the anointed king of Israel, declares that there exists a higher order, an earlier order, an eternal order, the order of Melchizedek. No Levitical priest publicly contested that declaration. At least no contestation survived in the records. The records reveal something no one expected. In 1947, in the caves of Qumran near the Dead Sea, Bedouin shepherds discovered the first of more than 900 manuscripts that would become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among them was a fragment catalogued as 11Q13, also called 11Q Melchizedek. This document, dated to the 1st century before the Common Era, reveals that the Qumran community, most likely Essenes, had an elaborate theology about Melchizedek that went far beyond what the biblical text stated explicitly. In the Qumran fragment, Melchizedek appears as an eschatological figure, a celestial being who would execute judgment at the end of times. The document cites Isaiah chapter 61 and Psalm 7, connecting Melchizedek to the liberation of captives and the judgment of fallen angels. For the Essenes, Melchizedek was not simply a Canaanite king who appeared briefly in Abraham's story. He was a cosmic figure with authority over spiritual principalities. Follow the process of interpretation across the centuries. There was no consensus, and there still isn't. The main theories about Melchizedek's identity divide into at least 5 distinct schools of thought, each with serious defenders. The first school, supported by various critical scholars and by Flavius Josephus, holds that Melchizedek was simply a Canaanite priest-king. In the ancient world of the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, the fusion of royal and priestly functions was common. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt in 1887, include correspondence from Abdi Heber, governor of Jerusalem in the 14th century before the Common Era, who also exercised religious functions. In this reading, Melchizedek was a legitimate local ruler who worshipped God Most High, El Elyon in Hebrew, as the supreme deity, within a primitive monotheistic tradition that existed in parallel to Canaanite polytheism. The second school, present in certain rabbinic texts of the Talmud, specifically in Tractate Nedarim, folio 32, side B, identifies Melchizedek as Shem, son of Noah. The biblical chronology allows this reading. If the numbers in Genesis chapter 11 are calculated literally, Shem would still have been alive in Abraham's day, at approximately 465 years of age. In this tradition, Shem would have settled in Salem and assumed priestly functions as patriarch of the lineage from which knowledge of the true God descended. The Jerusalem Targum and Targum Pseudo-Jonathan both adopt this identification. The third school, radically different, emerges in the Book of 2nd Enoch, an apocryphal text dated between the 1st century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. In chapters 71 and 72 of that text, Melchizedek is described as having a miraculous birth. The narrative recounts that Ner, Noah's brother, had a wife named Sopanim, who conceived without conjugal union. The child was born after his mother's death and emerged already developed, seated beside her body, bearing the mark of the priesthood on his chest. The archangel Michael then carried the child to paradise to protect him from the flood, and he reappeared afterward as a priest. This tradition, though non-canonical, reveals the intensity of ancient curiosity about Melchizedek's origins. The fourth school is directly Christological. Some early church fathers, including Ambrose of Milan in the 4th century of the Common Era, suggested that Melchizedek was a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. The logic was that the description in Hebrews chapter 7, without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, could only apply literally to a divine being. The fifth school, and the one most widely supported by contemporary biblical scholars, argues that the author of Hebrews is not making an ontological statement about Melchizedek, but a literary one. The silence of the Genesis text regarding Melchizedek's parents, birth and death is used typologically as a narrative device that makes Melchizedek a type, a prefiguration of a priesthood that transcends human lineage. What actually happened demands a reading that none of these schools, in isolation, fully exhausts. There then emerges the most extensive and systematic text ever written about Melchizedek in the canonical documents. The letter to the Hebrews, chapters 5 through 7, dedicates 56 verses to the analysis of this figure. No other biblical text devotes so much space to a character who appears in only 3 verses of Genesis. The proportion is extraordinary. Nearly 20 verses of analysis for every verse of original narrative. Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, establishes the foundation. Melchizedek is presented with 7 characteristics: King of Salem, priest of God Most High, he who blessed Abraham, he who received the tithe, King of Justice by translation of his name, King of Peace by translation of his title, and, the most controversial, without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, made like the Son of God, remaining a priest forever. Examine the rhetorical construction. The author of Hebrews is not inventing information. He is building an argument from the absence of information. In the Jewish priestly world, genealogy was the most important document a priest could possess. Ezra chapter 2, verses 61 through 63, records that after the Babylonian exile, priests who could not locate their genealogical records were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. Without genealogy, no priesthood. It was an absolute rule, and Melchizedek functioned outside that rule. Hebrews chapter 7, verses 4 through 10, then develops the most audacious argument in the text. The author asserts that by receiving the tithe from Abraham, Melchizedek demonstrated his superiority to the patriarch. And since Levi, the ancestor of all Israelite priests, was in the loins of Abraham, not yet born but genetically present, then Levi also paid tithes to Melchizedek. The conclusion is devastating for any defender of Levitical supremacy. The priesthood of Melchizedek is prior to, superior to, and independent of the Aaronic priesthood. It was not enough to challenge the lineage. Now the argument challenged the law itself. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 12, declares with surgical clarity, "For when the priesthood is changed, of necessity there takes place a change of law also." That sentence, in the context of the 1st century, was explosive. The Levitical priesthood and the Mosaic law were so intertwined that altering one meant altering the other. And the author of Hebrews was asserting that both had been altered, not abolished, but superseded by something that already existed before them. Measure the cultural impact of that claim. The Temple of Jerusalem, rebuilt by Herod, beginning in 19th before the Common Era, was one of the largest structures in the ancient world. The Temple Mount platform covered approximately 144,000 square meters, the equivalent of 20 professional soccer fields. The foundation stones weighed up to 570 tons each. More than 4 fully loaded Boeing 747 aircraft stacked on top of one another. More than 10,000 workers labored on its construction for over 8 decades. The priests who served in that temple belonged to 24 divisions, each serving for 1 week, twice a year, in a system that involved approximately 7,200 active priests. And Hebrews was asserting that the entire system pointed towards something greater that had already existed in Abraham's day. The human cost of the Levitical priesthood helps comprehend the weight of that comparison. Serving in the temple was physically devastating. Priests worked barefoot on limestone floors that in Jerusalem's winters dropped to temperatures near 0 degrees Celsius. They carried animals for sacrifice weighing between 30 and 60 kilograms. The blood from the daily sacrifices, 2 lambs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, plus individual offerings, covered the floor to the point of requiring a drainage system with channels carved into the rock that carried the blood to the Kidron Valley. The smell was permanent. Flavius Josephus in Jewish Wars, Book 5, Chapter 5, describes the temple complex with details suggesting an environment where animal sacrifice was constant, industrial, unceasing. The priests who served in the most active divisions performed between 50 and 80 sacrifices per day during the major feasts. At Passover, Josephus estimates that 255,600 lambs were sacrificed in a single festive period. Even adjusting for possible historical exaggeration, the real number likely exceeded 100,000 animals in just a few days. The physical toll on priests handling knives, fire, and animals for 12 to 14 consecutive hours resulted in frequent cuts, burns, and chronic exhaustion. Talmudic records mention priests who fainted during service on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest fasted and performed rituals lasting from before dawn until nightfall. That was the priesthood, according to the order of Aaron. Blood, fire, exhaustion, and endless repetition. And the text of Hebrews contrasted all of it with a scene of bread and wine in silence in the valley of Shaveh. The revelation of what Melchizedek represented carried political implications that are frequently overlooked. In the 1st century, when Hebrews was written, the high priesthood in Jerusalem had become a deeply corrupted institution. Since the Roman conquest in 63 before the Common Era, the office of high priest was essentially appointed and removed by Roman authority. Between 4 before the Common Era and 70 of the Common Era, there were 28 high priests, a turnover rate that revealed the complete political subordination of the office. The family of Annas controlled the high priesthood for decades, accumulating wealth through commerce in the temple courts. Archaeological records from the house of Caiaphas, discovered in 1990 in the Abu Tor neighborhood of Jerusalem, revealed a luxurious palace with ornate ossuaries, frescoed walls, and Roman imports, a brutal contrast to the poverty of priests from the lesser divisions, who often returned to Galilean villages where they lived as farmers between their turns of service. It was in that context of a degraded priesthood that the author of Hebrews pointed to Melchizedek, not as a political alternative, but as evidence that the original priesthood, the first priesthood recognized by the first patriarch, had never depended on lineage, political power, or temples of stone, Follow the argument to its most radical conclusion. Hebrews chapter 7, verses 23 and 24, establishes the final distinction. The Levitical priests were many because death prevented them from continuing. But the one who is priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, holds a priesthood that is unchangeable because he continues forever. The Greek word used is aparabatos, untransferable, inviolable, that which does not pass to another. In the Greek legal literature of the period, that word appeared in contracts that could not be annulled by any authority. The author chose legal terminology, not poetic. It was not enough to be eternal, it had to be juridically irrevocable. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25, then delivers the sentence that concentrates the entire argumentation of 3 chapters. Therefore he is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. The connection is complete. Melchizedek was not the end point, he was the frame. The priest without genealogy was the model of a priesthood that depended on no human blood, no temples built by hands, no systems that death could interrupt. The temporal shift. Centuries passed. Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era. The temple that took more than 80 years to build burned in a single day, on the 9th of Avi, on precisely the same date that the first temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 before the Common Era. More than 1 million people died during the siege, according to Josephus. The Levitical priests who survived lost everything: the temple, the altar, the genealogical records that proved their lineage, the sacrificial system that justified their existence. In 1 generation, the priesthood of Aaron ceased to function, and it was never restored. The priestly genealogical records, maintained for more than 1,500 years on scrolls kept in the temple itself, were consumed by fire. No living Jew today can documentarily prove descent from the priestly lineage with the precision the law required. Modern genetic testing, such as the Y chromosome study, published in the journal Nature in 1997 by Karl Skorecki, identified genetic markers common among Jews who identify as Kohanim, priestly descendants, but genetic markers are not genealogical records. The law required documentation, and the documentation turned to ash. The priesthood, according to the order of Aaron, depended on records that could burn. The priesthood, according to the order of Melchizedek, never had records to burn. That was the difference. Consider the structural irony of this entire narrative. The most elaborate, most regulated, most documented priesthood in ancient history, with its 720 annual service rotations, its 4 types of animal sacrifice, its 13 musical instruments in the Levitical choir, its pure gold bells on the high priest's robe that collectively weighed more than 2 kilograms. That priesthood required a temple that cost the equivalent of billions in current currency and the labor of more than 18,000 men in the final phase of construction alone, and it was permanently interrupted in a single day. Meanwhile, a man without a temple, without special vestments, without a choir, without a recorded genealogy, offered bread and wine to a dust-covered warrior. And 3,900 years later, that scene still defines an entire theological category. What the archaeological excavations in Jerusalem reveal makes everything more concrete. The foundations of the city of Salem, on the southeastern hill known as the City of David, date to approximately 3,500 before the Common Era. When Melchizedek ruled, the city had probably between 1,000 and 1,500 inhabitants, occupying an area of no more than 5 hectares, smaller than many contemporary shopping center parking lots. The walls were between 2 and 3 meters thick, built with local limestone without mortar. The principal water source was the Gihon Spring in the Kidron Valley, accessible through an underground tunnel that the Jebusites would carve through the rock centuries later. It was a tiny city, and its priest-king would become the paradigm for all priesthood that followed. Archaeology also revealed something about the religious context. Excavations in Canaan uncovered temples from the Middle Bronze Age, approximately 2000 to 1500 before the Common Era, at Megiddo, Hazor, and Shechem. Those temples served deities such as Baal, El, Asherah, and Dagon. Syncretism was the norm. A priest who served El Elyon, God Most High, in a region dominated by polytheism, represented a significant cultural anomaly. Melchizedek was not only outside the future Levitical system, he was outside the dominant religious system of his own time, and Abraham recognized him immediately. Consider what that reveals about Abraham. He had come from Ur of the Chaldeans, a city with temples dedicated to the moon god Sin, with ziggurats more than 20 meters tall and more than 200 professional priests. Abraham knew institutionalized religion. He knew complex priestly hierarchies, and upon encountering a man with no monumental temple, no visible hierarchy, no priestly retinue, he decided that man deserved 10% of everything he possessed. Abraham's decision was not naive. It was discernment, the entire convergence of data, the Genesis text, the Psalm of David, the Qumran fragments, the letter to the Hebrews, the records of Josephus, the archaeological excavations, points toward a conclusion that surpasses any single interpretive school. Melchizedek functions in the ancient texts as a fissure in the system. Evidence that before the laws, before the temples, before the lineages, before the blood sacrifices and the golden bells and the purple vestments, there existed a form of priesthood that needed none of it to be recognized as legitimate. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 16 defines that form with clinical precision, not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. The Greek word for endless is a katalitos, literally something that cannot be undone, decomposed, or destroyed. The author chose a word from chemistry and physics, not from theology. An akatalitos substance is one that does not degrade. Applied to a priesthood, the image is of something that functions independently of any external condition. Temples fall. Records burn, lineages are lost, empires crumble, priests die. And what Melchizedek represented remains intact in the text, waiting to be read again by each generation that encounters those 3 verses in Genesis and asks how 55 words in Hebrew can contain so much. The destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era did not merely eliminate a building. It eliminated the entire infrastructure of a priestly system that had functioned, with interruptions, for more than 1400 years. The ashes of Herod's temple carried with them the records of 24 priestly divisions, the service rosters of thousands of Levites, the cultic instruments valued in tons of gold and silver. Titus carried the spoils to Rome, where they were carved into the Arch of Titus that still stands today in the Roman Forum. A marble monument 15.5 meters tall that freezes in stone the precise moment when the Aaronic priesthood lost its last sacred objects. And somewhere in that same city, in those same years, communities read aloud the letter to the Hebrews and heard that none of it needed to be rebuilt. Because what Melchizedek represented had never needed stone to exist. The man without father, without mother, and without death was never merely a man. He was the first recorded evidence that the sacred can operate without structure, without bureaucracy, and without human permission. 3 verses in Genesis, 55 words, and a priestly order that survived everything that should have rendered it obsolete. Sometimes what cannot be explained is precisely what does not need to be explained. It only needs to be recognized. Abraham recognized it, and that was enough.